Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see, well, I'm Valerie Hotchkiss, sorry, University Librarian. It's great to see you out there, you lovers of books and reading, I assume, in libraries. That's part of the reason you're here. You may also be fans of our author, Martin Seay, but that basically amounts to the same thing. If you like him, you like books, you like libraries. And I'm glad you're here. This is a very special night, not only because we have Martin Seay with us in our midst, but also because it marks the relaunch of our Friends of the Library group after a hiatus of about a dozen years. The first speaker, well, it was founded, I should say, in 1974 by Alexander Hurd's wife, our chancellor's wife, Jean Hurd, founded this society, very influential in building collections, sponsoring events like this, raising funds, of course, and now we revivified it, I'm pleased to say, and also pleased to say that our advisory board includes another brilliant woman with close ties to the chancellor, Lydia Howarth, as well as Jean and Alexander Hurd's daughter, Connie Hurd, a distinguished musician in our music school, and Marty Conrad, who's right here in our audience. She's a loyal alum and a member of the original Wild Bunch group, which deserves a program of its own, so I'm not going to go into what that is. But I hope that they will inspire you two to join the Friends of the Library as we start over again. So the first speaker in this in a series that we did for the Friends of the Library way back in 1974 was Fred Friendly, president of CBS and Edward R. Murrow's producer. He spoke about the future of reading and whether it would survive America's obsession with television. So here we are again with a bright mind to muse with us about the future of reading in the face of different sorts of new communication technologies. Other Friends speakers in the past have been Cleanth Brooks, Peter Taylor, Reynolds Price, and Eudora Welty. No pressure, Martin. But actually, that's precisely why we invited Martin as our first speaker for the relaunched Friends. We want to offer programs that will bring us the brightest minds out there, innovative thinkers, to help us engage with issues of the day, social, political, literary issues of the day. And Martin Seay is, according to The Guardian, which I read religiously and believe every word of, quote, a writer of exceptional and eclectic intelligence, end quote. He was born in Texas, a land that breeds storytellers. He attended Trinity University in San Antonio before getting his MFA at Queen's University in North Carolina. The Mirror Thief is his first novel, but he's already been compared to Umberto Eco, David Foster Wallace, and Italo Calvino. The Chicago Review of Books has named The Mirror Thief the best debut novel of 2016, while NPR, the New York Times, and Publishers Weekly all named it a best book of the year. And for those of you who have read the book, you'll understand why we thought Martin would be the perfect person to discuss the future of reading in the iPhone age. And speaking of smartphones, we're doing a live closed caption for this event, and you can read what is being said if you just get a URL from Nancy in the back, if anybody wants that, or you could get it afterwards and then see the text afterwards. So Martin's going to offer a brief reading from his book, and then we're going to settle in for a chat about the future of reading, as I mentioned, before we disband into the library lobby for refreshments and book signings. After the reading, after Martin finishes reading, Samuel Rutter will help us get the conversation started. And I hope you'll all feel comfortable chiming in. Sam's a student in our distinguished MFA program here at Vanderbilt. He comes here, oh, and I should thank the Creative Writing Program for their help in organizing this event and for lending us Samuel for this. Sam hails from Australia, where he earned a PhD in Spanish and Latin American Studies at the University of Melbourne. And in addition to writing fiction, Sam has published several books at the same press as Martin Seay, some of them translations of contemporary Latin American authors. He's also the editor of the Nashville Review. So let's get started by welcoming our guest, Martin Seay, who will read a few passages from The Mirror Thief.
thank you all very much for being here this evening. Thank you very much, Valerie, and to the library, and to Kate and the creative writing department. I'm going to read from my novel, The Mirror Thief, which is a novel about Venice. It doesn't all happen in Venice. A third of it happens in Las Vegas in 2003, the days immediately prior to the US invasion of Iraq. A third of it happens in Southern California in 1958, in the days that the beat poetry and art movement is starting to catch fire there. And then a third of it happens in the city-state of Venice in 1592. Basically what goes on in this book is, at least in the 1592 sections, from about, y'all probably know this because you're smart folks, but from about 1500 to about 1700, the city-state of Venice maintained a monopoly on the manufacture of large, flat glass mirrors. Prior to about 1500, if you saw a mirror in Europe, it was probably small and flat and steel, or it was large and curved and glass. They would blow as big a glass ball as they could and cut off a hemisphere of it. And you get a mirror that looks like the mirror in the Arnolfini portrait, if you know the Arnolfini portrait. But the Venetians figured out how to flatten them out. That produced a source of revenue for Venice that was concerning to the various houses of Europe. There was a lot of money moving, particularly from the aristocratic folks throughout Europe, in Venice's direction, because everybody needed these things. So there's an industrial espionage element in the 1592 sections. So I'm going to read a little bit, just a couple minutes from each of the beginnings of each of those sections, just to give you all a flavor of the text. I don't think you need to know much. I'll give a little bit of plot information as I start each section. In the first section, which is the Vegas 2003 section, Curtis is a recently retired Marine who is in Las Vegas looking for Stanley, who's a family friend, who's also kind of an infamous professional gambler who's gone missing under suspicious circumstances. He's there at the behest of his friend Damon that he knows from the Marine Corps. The day shift comes on at noon, and Curtis begins walking down Fremont, from the Elko to the plaza, stopping at every casino along the way. He talks to croupiers and dealers, waitresses and bartenders, floor people, security guards, and every pit boss or casino host whose ear he can bend. In each case, he tailors his story to his audience, mostly blowing variations on, I'm looking for a friend, he's staying somewhere in town, I'm hoping to throw some action his way. Everybody gets Curtis's cell number, and he drops a few double sawbucks where he thinks they might do some good. A couple of people say they've seen Stanley in the last week or so. Everyone over the age of 40 seems to recognize his name. Curtis was nervous at first about operating in the open, laying such thick spoor, but he's over that now. If he's not visible, then this isn't going to work, not in what little time he's got. He's never been wired for cloak and dagger shit anyhow, which by now Damon should know. Sneaking around, in Curtis's view, it generally amounts to time wasting. Better to just say what you want than own whatever comes with wanting it. If Damon has a problem with that approach, he could have called somebody else. Out here, Curtis has done nothing wrong, has nothing to hide from. Not yet, anyway. At each place he stops, he makes the same clockwise circuit of the tables, scanning the crowd for Stanley's bald head, his narrow shoulders, his beaked nose. He comes up empty every time, but always feels like there's something he's not seeing. He's rusty and still doesn't trust his eye. He leaves Main Street Station with 2 rolls of quarters in his pocket and catches the trolley to the Stratosphere, starting his long trek south. He's making better time, zeroing in on the right people. Pit bosses with $10 haircuts, middle-aged bartenders, valets who look him in the eye. Damon's cash is going fast, but Curtis feels like he's buying something with it now. Nobody's asked him any tough questions, but he runs through his story anyway, rehearsing made-up dialogue as he's passing between casinos, crossing the boulevard, thinking back to 10 days ago, South Philly, Damon in a booth in the Penrose Diner, swirling the dregs of his third coffee, brown parabola lapping the bone-white rim. I'm not asking you to lie, just keep it simple. If anybody presses you, just tell them you're collecting on a marker. That's the truth, right? Yellow hair trimmed to a uniform half-inch, longer than Curtis had ever seen it. Beige houndstooth suit wrinkled like it'd been slept in, though Damon clearly hadn't slept in days. The trick is to have layers, see? You give up a little, they think they got the whole picture. Dark eyes, watery but alert like greased ball bearings, one obsidian cufflink in his black poplin sleeve, a few raveled threads where its mate was torn out. It's fine to drop my name if you think that'll help. Nobody's going to know what happened in Atlantic City, or if they do know, they won't make any connections. A new mobile phone atop an unmarked number 10 envelope, an e-ticket printout inside wrapped around 3 packs of $100 traveler's checks. What you tell your wife is your business. Look, this is not dangerous. Nobody's breaking any laws. You find him and you call me. You do it no later than 12 a.m. next Tuesday night. It's that simple. Curtis watched Damon's Audi pull out of the lot and disappear up the on-ramp toward the Whitman Bridge. He finished a slice of apple pie along with the chocolate Napoleon that Damon had barely touched, ordered himself another coffee, and sat not reading his newspaper until nearly rush hour when he walked back to the subway. The next morning he awoke at 4 with Danielle's alarm, listened as she dressed and left for work, and lay sleepless and staring at the sky through the mini blinds as it went from black to red to yellow to white. Then he rose and cleaned up and caught the bus down to Collingdale, where he bought the gun. South of Fashion Show Mall, the casinos are bigger, busier now that it's later in the day, and everything takes longer. By 8 o'clock, he's past the airport, leapfrogging places that seem unlikely, feeding quarters to the southbound trolley as it carries him from block to block to block. He stops at the buffet at the Tropicana to load up on prime rib and peeled shrimp by the glow of heat lamps and coral reef aquariums, then sits for an hour above the deserted pool and watches the reflections of palm trees nod in the wind-pearled water. Once his food is settled, he humps it east to the Hotel San Remo, west to the Orleans, south to the Luxor and Mandalay Bay. On the long ride back to his own hotel, he nods off for a second, then jolts awake, his heart skittering. Outside the streaked bus windows, the city seems different, alive in a way that it wasn't before. The steady foot traffic along the boulevard, laughing and shouting and acting out, and the street is full of high-end rental cars, windows down, stereos rattling. Stretched limousines idle at curbside, sly and circumspect, while the sidewalk procession slides backlit across their mute black windshields. Time seems to pass in a hurry. Curtis thinks of bad places he's been, of nights he's spent along razor-taped perimeters, eyeing burning wells and distant winks of small arms fire, very different from this. But the same nervous thrill, the same sense of something gathered just beyond the lights, waiting for a signal to move. For the first time in a long while, Curtis feels as if he's in the world again, the real world, inhuman and unconstructed, where he can be anybody or nobody, and where anything is possible. I will stop there for Las Vegas. I'm going to read 2 more, and these are quicker. This is the very beginning of the 1958 section. Because it's the very beginning, you don't need to know anything. Low clouds gather over the Pacific, cushioning the winter sun as it drops, and the beachcombers are coming in. For a moment, the colonnades are unshadowed, and a rosy glow lights the winged lions on the frieze of the St. Mark's Hotel. Across Market Street, there's a boarded-up gaming parlor, Fortune Bridgeo in faded letters on its southern wall, and this is where the boy has set up his game. The King of Hearts, the 7 of Hearts, the 7 of Diamonds, each creased lengthwise up its middle, 3 tiny roofs gliding across a flattened Wheaties box. Picture him there, kneeling under the Roman arches, small and muscular, maybe 16 years old, cropped curly head already balding. He's dressed in blue jeans and a freshly stolen pair of crepe-soled Pedwins. His pink sear-check sleeves are rolled past his elbows. A battered work jacket rests within easy reach, but though the evening air is cool and goose flesh rises on his arms, the boy doesn't put it on. The pavement is gritty with sand, littered with shards of window glass and chunks of stucco from the crumbling facade. The boy rests his knees on a folded-over tabloid, a Mirror News from last week. Faisal Hussein proclaim Arab Federation, it reads. Dodgers close to Coliseum deal. It's seawater warped, already yellow from the sun. The boy has lately taken to calling himself Stanley. When he hopped the southbound B&O in Staten Island last April, he began using the alias Adrian Cravano, and that name carried him as far as Little Rock before he was rousted by cops twice in 5 hours and had to come up with something else. He pulled Stanley off the side of a Roll-O-Rama coach parked at a mechanic shop. He was Adrian Stanley in Oklahoma and Missouri, Stanley Wells in Colorado and New Mexico, and when he finally crossed the California state line in mid-December, he briefly considered taking the name Adrian Wells, like certain spiders that lure their quarry by resembling it, before deciding that that could only cause problems for him. Most of his names have come from a book in his jacket's inner pocket, a book of poems that he has read many times and now knows by heart. It's a strange book. There's very little in it that he can claim to fully understand, but it has taught him one rule about which he has no doubt. Calling a thing by its name gives you power over it. Therefore, you must be careful. The boy's own given name he does not use and never has. The boardwalk fills as the beach empties. The shadows of passers-by lengthen and strobe, and the shuttling cars seem at times to hang in midair. You are thinking these things. The boy is not. His mind contains nothing but the sensation of regular motion, the steady click of the falling cards. Memory is a skill as well as a habit. The boy is still young. What do you remember? Let's do the beginning of 1592. The acolyte lights the candles as the priest opens the book. The long wicks flare, and the image of the Virgin appears in the vaults above the apse, her gray form steady against the flickering screen of gold. The glass tesserae of her eyes catch the dim light, and her gaze seems to go everywhere. The priest's hands moves across the psalter, its thick pages curl and fall. Venite exultemus Domino, ubliemos Deus salutari nostro, he intones. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving and make a joyful noise unto him with psalms. At the priest's back are the relics of Saint Donatus, along with the bones of the dragon he slew by spitting in its mouth. Overhead, the wooden roof slopes outward like a ship's hull. Even now, hours before dawn, the basilica is not empty. Solitary figures pass in the aisles, sleepless fishermen, glass blowers between shifts, veiled widows impatient for Christ's return. Some kneel and mutter prayers. In the narthex at the base of a marble column, a lone drunkard snores. At the south end of the shallow transept, a man drifts along the uneven stones. His steps are cautious, slow, measured by the soft tap of his walking stick. His downcast eyes trace images on the mosaic floor, eagles and griffins, cockerels bearing a trussed fox, peacocks eating from a chalice. Beneath the clean flames of the beeswax candles, the patterned checks of porphyry and serpentine blend into a fluid surface, undulating and unfathomable. The man lifts his black Morocco boots like a heron hunting frogs. Picture him there, between the piers of the old brick church, gaunt and sinewy, around 35 years old, wearing the long black robe of a Bolognese doctor. His small forked beard is trimmed close, his red blonde hair cropped a bit shorter than is the current fashion. He is somewhat less filthy, less flea and louse-ridden than those he moves among. His velvet cap and brocade jerkin are rich but not ostentatious. His worn, lopsided face suggests a difficult birth and many misfortunes suffered since. There is a strangeness to his aspect, a detachment that those who meet him tend to ascribe to his erudition or to his many years spent abroad, although in doing so they are mistaken. The sea is his, and he made it, chants the priest. His hands form the dry land. Mist rises from the canal outside, wetting the ocean to the darkness, bearing a chill through the heavy wooden doors. The black-robed man shivers, turns to go. Let this be him, then, Crivano, the mirror thief. Let him bear the name. Who else can claim it? I will stop there. Thank you for your patience.
Can everybody hear me?
Can everybody hear me? No. Let's try this. How about this? Better? Worse? All right, cool.
So thank you, Martin, for reading from us there.
Absolutely.
I'm even more grateful that you started by giving some sort of summary or description of the book, because as I was reading it and reading the reviews out there, it's a book that has so many facets to it.
Yes.
So many genres working in the same pages. There's elements of noir, it's a novel of ideas. Because we're here tonight to talk about the future of reading, I thought we might open with Stanley, who was the main character in the Venice Beach section. And he, for those of you who've read the book or haven't, he is on this search for a book of poems called The Mirror Thief by a beat poet named Adrian Wells. And so, as I was reading it, I was struck by the way that several characters in this book, they turn to reading and books as something that's really, really important in their life, life-changing, life-motivating. And in that way, it reminds me of some of the great works of literature. You've got Cervantes and Don Quixote, who goes out on missions because of books he reads. Emma Bovary, whose life falls apart, basically, because of novels. So I wonder if you could speak, maybe we could start by talking about how important reading is on all these levels, for the characters, for you, for the reader in the room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It was something that showed up pretty early for me as I was sort of initially conceiving of the book. I knew from early on that the book was going to be about mirrors and about the mirror industry in Venice as sort of the main plot engine driving at least those portions of the book. And I was thinking a lot about the flat glass mirror as a technology, you know, and in a sense, you can make an argument that it's an early screen-based technology. You know, it's a flat surface that you look at that presents an illusion that helps you better perceive yourself, or at least, you know, up to a certain point. And you can figure out what that point is at your peril, probably. And I began to think of the fact that, in a sense, like the printed page is also a flat surface that presents illusions that will allow you to better understand yourself. And you can, at your peril, figure out exactly where that illusion breaks down. So those are this idea of visual means of understanding the world versus a linguistic or verbal means of understanding the world was a tension that I wanted to play with throughout the book. And you know, I picked those as kind of arbitrary targets, and I kept coming across little biographical details that just kept encouraging me. It doesn't really make it into the book, but it was only very fleetingly. But this seemed to indicate to me that I was on the right track. Like, do you all know what Gutenberg, right, the movable type guy, you know what he did before he was a printer?
He had polished mirrors.
He polished mirrors, yeah. He sold mirrors at the shrine at Ashen that you would use them to trap the holy emanations from the relics. And some have theorized, I think without a ton of basis, but it's interesting that the idea of the reversal that is required for a movable type might have been related to the reversal that you get from a mirror. It might have been something it would have been thinking about. Interesting to contemplate. But you come across stuff like that and you're like, okay, yeah, maybe there's something here. Yeah,
To stay with mirrors for a moment.
Sure.
You know, I suppose a mirror is, the idea is it gives you back a true reflection of who you are. And I think nearly every single character in this book is trying to pass themselves off as something they're not.
That's exactly right.
Where do you see, without trying to be too leading here, where do you see the advent of social media, perhaps?
Oh, good Lord. Yeah, that's social media in concert with this is just a profoundly terrifying thing. That, you know, there was a lot of, and it was absolutely something that I was thinking of. You know, I started this book in 2002, which is really before the smartphone happened, but social media was starting to roll out at that point. And, you know, wrote it. It took me about 5.5 years to write it. So many of the things that I was a little concerned about as I was finishing it up have certainly not gotten better. You know, 2012, I think, if you all read there was an Atlantic piece relatively recently that mentions that in 2012 the majority of Americans had smartphones. and that the reported incidence of depression and anxiety among teenagers has skyrocketed since then. Social media is not a neutral technology. I mean, there are certain behaviors that it is designed to encourage. And when you pair it up with one of these, I think those become exacerbated very strongly. I think generally speaking, just kind of a banner to cast across the entire discussion, across the entire book, is I was thinking a lot about technologies for fashioning the self, for understanding the self, which are not the same thing and can be mistaken for each other, really throughout. But what I kept coming back to is that they really become dangerous when we cease to perceive them as technologies, when they become invisible to us as technologies, because that probably means they've started to use us instead of the other way around. You know, the mirror, we take it for granted. I mean, it's literally invisible. Like it only returns images. You cannot see a mirror. You only see effects that result from the presence of a mirror. But we don't appreciate how strange an object it is anymore. But you think about what it would have been like to introduce that technology to a culture circa 1500 or a little earlier. How enormously consequential that would be for self-fashioning, you know, particularly among the ruling houses, aristocratic houses, where now you've got this device that will help you perform a public self. Right now, you can, whereas before you could see yourself to shave, or you could see yourself in a distorted way in a room. Now you've got this device that will return an image of what you actually look like in a social space, which allows you to start to perform a social self. You can practice what you're going to look like at the gathering later tonight. At this point, as you give the speech, you can practice it. So the aristocratic Europe understood pretty early on that this was a technology that they needed to be able to do their jobs. That said, you know, it's fairly neutral. The book is also a pretty good technology for understanding the self in the sense that it's a good place to hold a narrative. You know, but we tend not to think of the book as a technology, but of course it is one. The novel is also a technology. It's the software that runs on the book. And the novel is also a means of understanding the self in a narrative way. So these are not new. Like the anxieties that we have, and you mentioned Bovary earlier, and like the thought that, you know, novels were polluting the minds of particularly young ladies. These things tend to be very gendered. But polluting the minds of the bourgeois who read them was a concern at that point too. So, you know, we always worry about the effect that technology is having on us. And the thing is, we should. You know, it is having an effect on us.
Is the book, the printed book, still a technology that's capable of being dangerous?
On a good day, yeah. You know, it's got a lot of competition now. And I don't think that's what its strength necessarily is. That just to be, you know, extremely paradoxical and Zen master about this, the strength of the book at this point is kind of its weakness. You know, because it is so limited. To contrast it with these things. The kind of interaction that you have through social media or in any sort of networked environment on your phone, like for one thing, you're holding this, your embodied experience of these technologies is important. The way you interact with the technology is important. Like you watch TV like this, you watch a movie like this, you talk to Sam like this, but you read like this. It's a private experience, even though you're communicating with other consciousnesses, it's still a private and one-to-one experience as you're in close with it, and that's what this is too. And that really changes the way you situate yourself in the world while you're using this technology. The difference is that when you read the book is, because of its limitations, its inbuilt limitations, it's tremendously imaginatively framed because you have to do so much work. Like, I don't teach writing on a regular basis. I have taught writing. I don't plan to do a lot of teaching writing, but the one smart thing that I came up with to tell people when I teach writing, and this is y'all's for free tonight, like, you have a really good day, you write something really brilliant, and there's this tendency sometimes, if you're the kind of person I am, to have this like moment where you're like, I've created this beautiful symphony, and when in fact you've just created a score. Like, any piece of writing is just a set of instructions for the reader, right? That the reader does almost all the work by moving into it imaginatively, by figuring out how to situate themselves in it, and filling in, because there's always a ton of absence in any book, it has to be, it's just words, to imaginatively fill it in. You don't do that on one of these, so.
Would you say, I was going to ask you about the nature of the novel as an immersive technology. Mm-hmm. So something that you'll notice with cinema, with the TV, mm-hmm. is that or with the smartphone, is you can do it while you do something else.
Right, yeah.
I don't think you can really do much else while you're reading a novel.
You can turn pages, you know. I mean, there's reading and there's reading, right? You know. So yeah.
I've been doing it wrong all these years.
Me too. That's I actually is this embarrassing to admit? I don't know. Admit it anyway. In preparation for tonight, I did something I'd never done before, which is hit the Wikipedia page for reading. Ever done this? That it describes. I'm not going to pretend I read this exhaustively, but it describes the means of reading. One of which I think was subvocalization, where you are hearing the words as you're reading along, which is apparently campaigned aggressively against by speed readers. I thought that was just reading. Like, that's the only way I do it, you know, which is why I get through like 15 books a year in a good year. To me, if you're not reading closely, you're not reading. You know, but I recognize that there's a value to reading stuff more quickly than that. There's a lot of ways to use this technology. You know, in terms of its immersiveness, I think again there's immersiveness and there's immersiveness. I think books are immersive because of their limitations, because of what they're requiring from you. Even if it's something that you picked up, you know, at the airport or whatever, and you know, you can buy lots of good books, including this one at the airport. But you know, it's something that has no aims other than to advance a narrative. You know, even then, like you're having to put a lot of information. Like, you know, someone's being chased down a mountainside. What's a mountainside? What's a mountain look like? You know, the book's not going to stop and tell you that.
Do you think that that's startlingly analog in the sense that if you were to read Mountainside mm-hmm. on your smartphone, you could probably click on Mountainside?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Do you see that as a challenge or a virtue?
Oh, a virtue, yeah. I mean, in terms of the failure of a book to be able to do that for you, yeah, no, I think that's one of the best things about the book is that you have no easy resource other than yourself. I mean, you should absolutely Google stuff when you come across something that doesn't make any sense. Go ahead, look it up. That's what Google's for. But that's not a bad thing. But yeah, but the fact that the book is not networked to anything except your own knowledge that you bring to the book. It's networked to you very extensively, but not to anything outside of itself. You know, it's also, to me, I think, sinister that, you know, we tend to think of in terms of when we're reading in an electronic environment that we have a lot of empowerment to look up, you know, I click on this and see what it means. I can get a dictionary definition, I can flag this. But, you know, the software is encouraging us to use it in certain ways. I mean, if it's successful, that's what it's doing. Certainly all the social media platforms are, I guess the word, which is apparently in the industry used as a good thing, and which I use as a scary thing, is gamified. You know, where you're you're given certain rewards for certain types of behavior on those platforms.
Doesn't it short-circuit the building of your own networks that you can build when you read a book?
Yeah, I think so.
Because it gives it to you too easily?
It gives it to you.
And also distracts, you know?
It's distracting. It gives them to you easily, but it doesn't give them to you on your terms, which I think is the key thing. That, you know, books are because of their limitations are, I think, an intrinsically empowering technology that you have to do so much to get it to work. It's a little irritating sometimes. It's much easier to just hop on Snapchat, but it's ultimately going to be more empowering of your own capacity to engage with media if you're in a very limited printed environment like this, versus what you think is your behavior on social media, particularly on a device like this, is not your behavior. You know, it's someone. A lot of people get paid a lot of money to make sure you do certain things, and when you're not doing things when you're doing things they didn't predict that you would do, that behavior, you know, their revenue model is keeping track of that behavior. You know, because information about your behavior can then be sold to better predict your behavior in the future and encourage you to do other things online. That it is an environment in which you are not empowered in any way, which is why it constantly tells you how empowered you are while you're on it. So,
This might be a good point to discuss Amazon.
yeah,
And algorithms and reading, and I suppose, you know, the initial address from the Friends of the Vanderbilt Library was,
Yes.
will reading survive television?
right.
Will reading survive Amazon is the next question.
It's yes, reading will survive. Period. You know, it does a thing that other things don't do. You know, as a species, we have our good days and bad days. We may not make it, but you know, there'll still be books around in the crater. You know, that I don't worry too much about reading. It's been remarkably persistent. You know, Fred Friendly, I think, would have. I'm not sure where he came down on the issue of whether it would survive television, and he thought it did. It did. Like, and I think because it does things that other things can't do, it will persist as to how remunerative it will be for the folks who put their personal and professional investments in it. I don't know. Probably continue to be fine. I mean, you look at the, you know, best as I could figure from the looking around that I've done. You know, book sales, printed book sales are up in the last couple of years. Ebook sales are down. Independent bookstores are doing quite well. Borders no longer exists, which is a reason why they're doing quite well. Barnes & Noble continues to be less and less of a bookstore every day, but still functions as a bookstore.
There's some information I saw which suggests that for the United States, the median number of books read still sits at about 5. So
Yeah.
half of Americans every year will read 5 or more, and that hasn't really changed over the past couple of decades.
Yeah. Could be that a small number of Americans are reading 50 books a year, which is fortunately skewing the numbers for those of us that don't read any. But yeah, it's a lot of books are still getting read. 5 could be better, could be worse. I can live with 5.
I think as well, some of the other information that's filtering through is that you know, the iPhone, the smartphone generation are also returning to library spaces
Yeah.
in numbers that we haven't seen for quite a few years. So
That's fantastic news.
I suppose I might want to ask you if you think that, are we reading more? Are we reading differently? Are we reading less?
Yeah, I think we're probably, just because, this is an intuition, I can't back this up with numbers, but I think we're probably reading more deliberately because, you know, because we have distractions that are superficially similar to the experience of reading a book. The decision to like put the phone down, or you know, the tablet, but it's really the phone that we're talking about, and read a book. I mean, and I think anecdotally, I think in that Atlantic article. I think the New York Times has, New York Times Magazine, I think on Sunday ran a piece, haven't read it yet, that seems to also reinforce this, that like reading a book, particularly for young readers, is really emerged as like a value expressive activity. Like tell you what I'm not doing while I'm reading a book is on my damn phone, and it feels good. So yeah, and I think people are recognizing it as a thing that is helpful to them as a means of situating themselves.
If we can agree then perhaps that we're reading the same or more amount and that it's still good for us,
yeah.
Would you, I still think I get a sense, I can't back it up, but that reading and literature seems to occupy a smaller slice of the public attention.
Yes. The overall slice of attention is getting bigger. Like I feel like the amount of things the average American is expected to pay attention to has vastly increased. Because, there's a ton of technologies that'll help give you this information that is probably of no value, and give you constant updates on that information. So, yeah, I think the overall share of attention that reading claims has probably decreased, but that may be because the overall, the claim that what we'll charitably call information exerts on an individual consciousness at this point has expanded vastly, or been expanded. There's, like I say, these are not neutral technologies. I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any means, but there's like folks who need you to use these platforms. They need content. And they need to encourage you in various ways, some obvious, some honorable, some less obvious, and some less honorable, to use those platforms. And that is why young people are as anxious today as they have ever been that we've been keeping track. So they're aware of the weight of this information.
And so with, I suppose, data expanding exponentially and perhaps the public attention fracturing, what do you think that means for an individual? For the people in this room we're all here because we're probably committed to reading?
Yeah, I hope so.
To reading books?
It's, yeah, I think it means that that the book has the same value as it always has, but I think that we may be more aware of that value and more aware of the decision to read as a value expressive act than it has been. And I hope, and I'm not just saying this is something I'd be saying regardless of which room I'm in, but I happen to be in a library. I think it should probably make us freshly aware of the value of institutions that encourage that kind of... Did I go... better?
Thank you.
Yeah. I was going to say...
Say it again.
But I was just saying nice things about libraries. That I think as we are more aware of the fact that when we read something, when we read a physical book, we're making a value expressive decision to do it, and that we're doing it as an alternative to other means of engaging with information. It causes us to value the book more than we would have otherwise, and differently than we would have otherwise. But I think it also is an opportunity for us to think about the institutions that we rely upon to make sure that we have access to these things, and that includes the one that we're sitting in now. The institutions, both in public libraries, are super important too, obviously. But private institutions like this one, and honestly, your neighborhood bookstore too. That those folks are. I don't think there's any way to overstate the value that an independent bookstore has to the culture at large. To speak specifically of libraries, I've done events in them recently and been thinking about what they do, and what I keep coming back to is this idea that it used to be that if you had access to information, you were empowered. And that's a little more complicated these days because of the various delivery devices for that information and the fact that they're not neutral anymore. That if you're receiving your information through particular platforms that are owned by folks whose major mission is to get you to continue to use that platform, that begins to affect the type and the value of the information that you receive. a place like a library is a place where not only are you going to be able to get information, but you're going to be helped by the talented staff of the library to use that information in a manner that is in your best interest. And that's really important. It's particularly important now. Yeah, you get the same thing at a bookstore, but I think libraries are a particular place where that is particularly to be valued. So,
speaking of the importance of those sorts of places, do you think, you know, we've got bookstores playing a role, publishers, libraries. In 2016, 2017, is it a radical act to write a 600-page novel?
That's, I wouldn't say that. It might be a radical act to publish one, and if our respective publisher was here, I'm sure he would tell you that it is. Yeah, I don't know. I don't want to oversell the value. I think this is a good book. I don't want to oversell the value of what it accomplishes. I think
I've been interested by, I've heard you say a couple of times, a value expressive choice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, we live in fraught times in America. Could you expound on that a bit?
Yeah. You know, I think that the kind of deliberativeness that you get, that you're induced to engage in when you're reading a book, is in fairly short supply at present. That, you know, there's a value to just being made freshly aware of what you don't know, that I think you get from reading, and that is not valued to the extent that it probably ought to be, at least in public discourse. The emphasis is on decisiveness. You know, I don't need to know that much, you know, to be able to make a decision. Seems to be how we're doing business these days. Yeah, I think that's, and I could also say, to put in a good word for fiction, if this is necessary, probably isn't, we're all here, but I feel like fiction is just a really good device, and maybe the best device we have for encouraging empathy with people who are just not like us, and partly that's from the experience of reading about just reading across difference, reading works by people who are not like us, but also just even, you know, that necessary gap that you have to cross anytime you read a fictional narrative, that you have to come in with your own imaginative equipment, and try to imagine your way into a book. That's something that fiction does regardless of what kind of fiction it is. So I think there's always a value to that, and I think it's understated.
That brings me back to something you read from the first section that I jotted down quickly. Forgive me if I got it wrong.
Oh, that's the problem.
That calling a thing by its own name gives you power over it. So I wonder how that applies perhaps to reading and writing in general, and also to, I guess, good citizenship.
Yeah, it becomes, it seems that every morning we wake up is another day where it's suddenly become more important to call things by their right names. You know, there's, and yeah, I think that's that idea that the naming a thing gives you power over it is certainly in the book. It's because there's a lot of magic in the book. There's a lot of people who are or alchemists or magicians who are interested in the capacity of language to give them control over the natural world. Overstated somewhat. It turns out that stuff doesn't actually work, but you know, we are left with this rhetorical sense in which it remains true. You know, if you can state something precisely, if you can name something like a phenomenon that we've been aware of, that we're surrounded by, you can identify it and call it what it is, then you have a kind of purchase on it at that point. Like it becomes freshly visible to us as a phenomenon that we can start to react to. But you got to name it first. So I think that's pretty important.
Do you think there's an element of alchemy to your own writing process? Are we conjuring something from nothing, or
no?
From something?
I ended up for all the alchemy in this book, and I have characters who speak pretty passionately about this thing that ultimately I'm not really convinced of. I think if there's anything magical that happens, it's in the reading, not in the writing. That's the thing that I keep. People will tell me that they will say nice things to me about the details in the Venice 1592 sections, which I appreciate. And I'll have these more extensive conversations with them when they talk about how I really got to the Renaissance era stuff, and it becomes apparent to me how much they've filled in. Like what I did was get like a couple of details right, and they know enough about Venice to have filled in the rest. I'm like, oh, you know what? You're giving me credit for a lot of work that you did. And I'm not saying it's not hard to pick those details that will cause that to happen, but that's the most satisfying thing, is when you've evoked something that caused the reader to bring their own stuff to the book and not realize that they did it. That's pretty cool, but it doesn't happen until it's read. So.
Well, speaking of readers, we do have a wonderful room of readers here. At any time, if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. It might be a good time to...
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody has anything you want to talk about.
I think the phrase "there's more magic in the reading than the writing" is perhaps a good one to break up and go eat some goodies and drink wine over.
Could also do that, yeah.
That sounds... Yeah.
Repeat the questions because we can't hear them.
Oh, we haven't
That
had
was
one.
just a general instruction to go and drink wine.
There was a reference made to dessert. Yeah. Yeah, if you have questions, come find me by the wine. Yes?
I was just going to ask you your reaction in your first segment. Your setting is Vanderbilt Hotel.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me your reaction to that when it was done in the hotel?
I was horrified, as I think we all were, I was listening to the news, as I mentioned, we were all listening to the news, and was just sort of eerily made aware of, because I've spent very little time in Las Vegas. I researched it extensively for the book, but haven't been there very much. And yet I found that I had a very clear mental picture of everything that was happening just based on all the time I spent thinking about the strips. It was weird because, it's something that I'm totally outside of. I don't have any special claim on grief from what happened there. But it was very easy. I get all my news from NPR basically while I'm driving to and from work, so I wasn't seeing video, but it was just horrifying, as I'm sure was your reaction to it. So, and that's probably where I should leave it. I think more to say more probably reduces that. So.
Just a quick question about your publishing your book.
Sure.
When you decided to write your book and publish it, was your publisher hoping that you would or would not do the print form? Did you have any influence one way or another?
No. My book is published by Melville House, which has also published some of Sam's translations, which I think they've got outside. I'm assuming you've had roughly the same experience with the good people at Melville House. They're great, but Sam and I were talking earlier about how we have, or at least I had this conversation with him near the beginning of the process where the publisher there, Dennis, basically just gave me a list of things that they didn't want my opinion about. It was like, before we even get to the part, because you're going to want to give me your opinions on this, let me just tell you right now, I'm not going to hear them. So here's some stuff that that we're definitely going to make the decision on because we know what we're doing. And this must have been on that list. I'm thrilled that it exists in paperback form. I love in the hardcover and the paperback. I love both of the covers that they did. It's an ebook as well. If y'all weren't aware of this, but dirty secret, authors make a lot more money off of ebooks than they do, a lot more money off of ebooks per unit than they do off of physical books. Still like physical books better though, I just feel like you have a totally different, my book club read my book, which I really appreciate because it's long and those people can't be honest with me because I know them. But it was interesting because like the folks who read it on paper and the folks who read it on the ebook, well, it's like they read a different book. It's just and partly that's because they're very different readers. Otherwise, they wouldn't be reading on ebooks. Exactly. Yeah. I was initially really excited because I was like, well, you'll be able to look up stuff. I did all this stuff where like. I intentionally did the word find through my Word document several times to track particular words to make sure I was using them in consistent ways and to deliberately try to have them accrue resonance to the book. I'll be like, this will be great. So everybody will appreciate all the work that I did. But of course, that's not how they use an ebook. I am honestly less concerned about and I think the numbers kind of bear it out at this point. E-readers, I don't love them, but I don't know that they hurt the book all that much. I think it just kind of expanded the market. I'm more worried about this, which instead of people are like, I don't need an e-reader. I'll just read books on my phone. No, you won't. You'll look at Snapchat. So you'll look at Twitter. But yeah, no, it's so yeah. I got there's an audiobook as well that I'm told is really good. But I have not heard it. So. Do
you know who read it?
I do. A guy named Eduardo Ballerini. He's an actor. He's on can't remember the name of it. He's on a show now. He's good. I've seen him on YouTube. He's a good actor. He's fluent in Italian, which I guess there's some Italian in the book. There's more Venetian than there is Italian. But yeah, apparently he nails it. Does a great job. So he's won awards and stuff for it. So more awards than I have won for this book.
So we might head out to the foyer now. So you're more than welcome to approach Martin with any more questions you might have. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Martin, for sharing.
Well, thank you, Sam.
Both of you. Just really superb.